here at Gettysburg College, and we are pleased to welcome our Constitution Day speaker, award-winning journalist and director of the Nationhood Lab at Salve, Regina University, Colin Woodard. Now, before I get into introducing Colin, just a couple of brief announcements. First of all, I'd like to welcome our student guests from Hood College who are joining us tonight. This program is being produced as part of the Hansen Fund, which brings together students please be sure to follow up with Ann Wofford. Ann, are you in the room? Ann is in the back of the room at the end of the event. And we'll make sure that your attendance is properly recorded. I know that there are a few of you who are here for that reason. But we are really glad to see so many members of our community. It's very important to us as a college that we integrate and that we welcome members of our community as part of this campus community as well. I just want to say very briefly, I mentioned Conversations for Change, which is an initiative that the college has launched this year to make sure that our community engages, our campus community engages with the larger community, and that we really, in this moment in our world, in this moment politically, in this moment as we think about world affairs, that we are infusing throughout our community the ability to engage and dialogue across difference, that we are incentivizing and encouraging and skill building the opportunity for our students to talk to people and spend time listening to people who think very differently that we do. And so we offer these opportunities in order to get you to maybe think about some ideas and perspectives that you have not had the opportunity to do so before. So after Colin speaks, we are also going to have some Q&A, which will give you a chance to do just that. So let me introduce to you our speaker for the evening. Colin Woodard is, as I mentioned, director of the Nationhood Lab at Salve Regina University's Pell Center. Colin is a New York Times bestselling author and an award-winning journalist. He is the author of 6 books that have been translated into 12 languages and inspired an NBC television drama. He won a 2012 George Polk Award, was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in 2016 for investigative projects at Maine's Portland Press Herald. He is a contributing editor at POLITICO. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, Smithsonian, and many other major publications. Colin, as you will likely hear before the end of this evening, is a native of Maine. We've had an opportunity to talk about that over the last day. He has reported from more than 50 countries and 7 continents. He lived for more than 4 years in Eastern Europe during the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the transition that followed. A graduate of Tufts University and the University of Chicago, he is also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and a past fellow in international journalism at Johns Hopkins. The title of his talk tonight is U.S. Democracy in Crisis: How we got here, why we're vulnerable, and what we can do about it. Please welcome Colin Woodard.
Well, thank you all for coming to Gettysburg College and the Eisenhower Institute for having me. As a historian, it's always a pleasure to be back in Gettysburg, which is so surrounded by history, literally. As mentioned, I run Nationhood Lab, which is a project at the Pell Center at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island, which looks at the problems of United States nationhood and how to solve for them. So we're busy a lot of the time. And tonight, I wanted to share 2 things with you about the state of US politics and society, and the stability of our democracy here in the midst of an extremely high-stakes election year. And at a time when the United States' revolutionary experiment in self-government is in the greatest crisis in a degree not seen since the 1860s. The first of those things will be an explanation of why the United States, despite its myriad advantages, is, and for much of its existence has, been divided against itself, and thus vulnerable to collapse. And secondly, later in my talk, I'm going to draw your attention to a key stratagem that we've been working on at Nationhood Lab that can help to hold us together against the forces of autocracy that threaten to bring down our republic and shatter the Union. Now, I'll discuss more about that in a few minutes, but to really understand the situation today, I want to offer what I hope will be some helpful background on the fundamental characteristics of the United States Federation, characteristics that make this country more structurally vulnerable than many of its liberal democratic peers. Now, the first of these things to know is that the US is not a nation state at all. We're a collection of stateless nations, each with their own intents, ideals, and story of national purpose. These regional cultures, which don't respect state or even international boundaries, have never been in agreement over the big questions. What's the proper role of government? What's the proper relationship between church and state? And even the meaning of such key words in the democratic lexicon as freedom or liberty. These stateless nations, these regional cultures, go back to the beginning of European conquest and settlement, to the 17th and early 18th centuries. The original colonies, those clusters, were settled by people from distinct regions of the British Isles and from France and the Netherlands and Spain, each with their own religious, political, and ethnographic characteristics. Each was colonized at a separate time and under a different political model. Some of these championed individualism, others utopian social reform. Some embraced an explicit Anglo-Protestant identity, others ethnic and religious pluralism. Some valued equality and democratic participation, others deference to an aristocratic order modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. The Puritan project in New England had very little in common with the neo-feudal aristocratic society of the Chesapeake country, or the Dutch commercial society encompassing what is now Greater New York City, or New Spain's far-flung northern frontier, or the West Indies slave society planted in the deep southern lowlands by English planters from Barbados. For generations, these distinct Euro-American cultures developed in remarkable isolation from one another, consolidating their own cherished principles and fundamental values, and expanding across the eastern half of the continent in nearly exclusive settlement bands. Now, they saw themselves as competitors for land, for settlers, for capital, and even as enemies, taking opposing sides in the English Civil War of the 1640s, in the American Revolution, in the War of 1812, and yes, of course, in the US Civil War. Here, by the way, is a map of the Spanish colonization of the Southwest, south to north. These are the areas actually settled on the ground, boots on the ground, so to speak, prior to the US annexations. The point I'm making is that there's never been an America, but rather several Americas. And today, there are 11. To see their effect, you really have to map them out using county-level data, because the regional cultures didn't respond to state boundaries, and often those state boundaries didn't even exist at the time that the colonization waves were happening. Now, there isn't time tonight to describe all of these to you now, but suffice to say they've always been divided on key issues with profound effects on American history and society. First, a quick remark on what this map represents. Like you saw on the previous slide, these are based on settlement colonization patterns. So the question at hand is, it's based on the cultural geographer Wilbur Zielinski's doctrine of first effective settlement. He was asking the question, okay, when people show up in a place where there weren't people, or they show up and push the people out who were there, how does that new human society manage to replicate its characteristics over time? How does that play out? And his theory, backed by a great deal of historical evidence, is, well, the first group that succeeds in kind of creating what ends up being a self-perpetuating society, the characteristics of that group will have an outsized influence on the future trajectory of that society, even if their numbers were really, really small compared to everyone who came later, because they kind of formatted the hard drive, right? The assumptions, all the things that anthropologists think of as culture, the stories of the good life, and who we're supposed to be and what we value and what in our history we treasure, what are the symbols, what are ideology, what are the institutions we have. We're all coded in early on, and everyone else had to deal with them as sort of a fait accompli. Can you change them? Sure, but they have a lot of inertia, and their staying power is enormous. So this map is showing you who were the first effective settlers of each county as these colonization drives happen. So I'll just pick one out and explain the pattern to you, and the same could be said for all the different regional cultures. We'll just do Yankeedom. So Yankeedom started in Massachusetts Bay with the Puritans coming in the 1630s, Winthrop's fleet. They showed up there, and here were a group of people who thought themselves to be in a covenanted Old Testament style relationship with God. You've been charged, they've been chosen to go do certain things in the world, to create a more perfect society in the New England wilderness. And they were going to do it as a group. And they would either be punished or rewarded as a group to whether or not they were following the plan. So your individual interests were not as important as the success of this project. They were people on a mission and better not mess with the mission or you're in trouble. They did these through shared institutions in town government format. They would come there, they'd go to the frontier, and the first thing they would do is divvy out the land in a relatively equitable fashion, build a town green, set up a taxpayer-financed compulsory public school, and a town meeting house and start governing themselves, right? It's not the, Davy Crockett out in the woods kind of model. It's very much a group, community, institutions, and the collective matters first more than the individuals because they're on this mission, right? It's a utopian project. So they arrived in Massachusetts Bay, they set up these communities, and then they go and they took the Pilgrims in the old colony and Cape Cod and absorbed them into their enterprise. They conquered the royalist settlements and proprietorships in New Hampshire, a crazy wayward feudal knight in Maine who had his own province. They all got drawn in and brought to heel and absorbed into the greater sort of Yankee New England zone. Connecticut faced the same thing. Then fast forward to the 1670s, right? New York wasn't New York. New York was the Netherlands. It was Dutch. And the Dutch had come first beyond Manhattan and the lower parts of the Hudson. But the Dutch in the 1670s lost an Anglo-Dutch war, and in the process lost this colony. And New Netherlands suddenly became an English colony, New York. When that happened, suddenly Massachusetts raised their hand and said, wait a minute. Now, why did they say that? Well, at least when I was in grade school, I don't know if that's changed, and you've got a map of the 13 colonies. That map in your textbook would look a lot like today's map of the 13 corresponding states, except that a lot of those states, Pennsylvania, Virginia among them, would have this Virginian or Pennsylvanian wide strip going all the way to the Pacific Ocean, right? Because their charters had said, hey, I so-and-so claim the land between that tree over there and this guy's wheelbarrow out to the next ocean. And they hadn't figured out what the ocean was, but wherever it is, we own it. They thought it was a lot closer to the Pacific, but they all ended up claiming these strips. Those are their legal documents. Massachusetts had such a claim. So when New Netherlands became New York, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts said, wait a minute, we own a Massachusettsian-wide strip of millions and millions of acres of this New York place. It belongs to us. Well, New York was to be the proprietary colony of the Duke of York, the king's brother, so they lost that argument about sovereignty. But by way of compensation, they were given land title to all of these contested zillions of acres in upstate New York, which the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had colonized by approved settlement companies with groups of Congregational and Presbyterian clergy bringing their flock from one town in New England to deploy New England model-style towns all through the upstate zone of New York, which is why if you go up there today and go to the old part of all these towns, they look a lot like the old New England towns because that's who set them up. Fast forward to the early Republic and the creation of the Northwest Territory and then the Ohio Territory. See that dark blue strip up there in northern Ohio around Cleveland on Lake Erie? That's the Western Reserve of Connecticut, because guess what? Connecticut had a Connecticutian size claim going all the way west. And that was their contested strip. It was going to be their Western Reserve. The federal government said, no, we're going to make this the Ohio's territory's property, but by way of compensation, Connecticut-based land companies run by Connecticut's government would deploy and settle that part of Ohio and only that part of Ohio. Settled by Yankee New Englanders using the same model. Other parts of Ohio were settled by completely different people. Fast forward to Michigan's creation, the early lumber industry was using 19th century industrial lumbering methods. That had been perfected in northern Maine. Most of the people who went to man the lumber industry were Mainers, and then most of the people who manned the government, who set up the territorial, conventions where they wrote the state constitutions, The first 5 of 6 territorial and state governors in Michigan were from the Yankee settled Western Reserve of Ohio, the Yankee settled upstate of New York, or New England itself. Replicating those similar institutions, same thing happened in Wisconsin and Minnesota and little bits of other parts of states. That's what the map's mapping and nothing else. I'm not adjusting it for today, I'm just saying who's the first effective settler in each zone. We could tell a similar story about all of these other places if we had another hour just to talk about American nations, but that's what you're seeing mapping. So everything that follows just happens to follow from that pattern laid down right there. So, all these places don't see eye to eye, I said. And they don't see eye to eye, among other things, on, for instance, how do you create a society where humans can be maximally and sustainably free? Let's advance the slide, though. Come on. I will need a troubleshoot to move forward one. Okay, yeah. Can you advance one for us? Do you emphasize individual liberty, as the Scots-Irish-inflected warrior culture of Greater Appalachia does, or the common good, as did the Puritans, with that belief that they're in this Old Testament-style covenant tasked to build this utopian society? In other words, is creating a free society ultimately about maximizing the autonomy of the individual, about personal sovereignty and lack of restraints, especially but not exclusively from government? If we had less government and less taxes and less regulation, is it not axiomatic that we would all be more free as individuals? Or is it that freedom is about building and maintaining the infrastructure and institutions of a free society? The schools and parks, roads and bridges, public universities, libraries, and clinics that act as a leveling mechanism to ensure that each person has a fair shot at achieving their potential of being meaningfully free, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. In other words, is it a shared endeavor, a social project, the cultivation of a Republican citizenry? The answer that I have, laid out in American character, is that an optimally functioning liberal democracy, small l, small d, maintains a balance between these two essential forces of freedom, to have them in equilibrium. But our problem, unlike most other liberal democracies out there, is that our regional cultures completely disagree on where the magic equilibrium balancing point is between those two aspects of freedom, or indeed, whether there should be a balance at all. Our federal politics, up until 2016 anyway, effectively centered on this question of individual liberty or the freedom of the community, which is why you see the map that I showed you before reflected on so many others. For instance, county-level election results. This one's the 1916 presidential map, Woodrow Wilson versus Charles Hughes, when Republicans, in red, were the party of communitarian values, and the Democrats, in blue, were the party of individual liberty and racial apartheid. Notice that communitarian Yankeedom and the communitarian Midlands, founded by the Quakers, happens to be part of Gettysburg, though you're getting close on the border. New Netherland, the area right around New York City, and the Pacific Strip are all aligning with the former, and the individualistic Deep South, Greater Appalachia, and Far West are aligned with the latter. And then, move on to this map. This is 2008, Barack Obama versus John McCain. As you can see, on a county level, it's the same map pretty much, except the colors have reversed, because by this time, the two parties had reversed their platforms, ideologies, and regional constituencies. And you can also see that the Deep South and Tidewater are no longer monochrome in one color, and you can now see the borders of El Norte popping up out against the far west, because between 1916 and 2008, Latinos and African Americans were able to exercise the franchise, and you're seeing that effect. Moving forward another. The existence of these regional cultures also affects the response to a contagious, deadly airborne virus. You can see here how the individual liberty nations hobbled the US response to the COVID-19 pandemic, resisting mask wearing and vaccines, mapped here by us by nation as of August 15th, 2021. This is the per capita vaccine rates at a time when vaccines had been easily available if you wanted to have them for many weeks. Some of the communitarian nations, if you can see the numbers on that, have almost double the per capita vaccination rates levels of the Deep South. And, not unrelated, next slide, these are the per capita COVID-19 deaths from the previous vaccineless summer in 2020, back when you had to stop, isolate, and wear masks in order to survive. You can see the same patterns popping up there. And you see those same patterns in the prevalence of various diseases. This one is diabetes prevalence from the Centers for Disease Control data at a per capita level, processed by our team and academic collaborators at the University of Minnesota and University of Illinois Chicago. As you can see, red is bad, blue is good. 12% compared to, say, 9% or so in some of the other regions. The Deep South and Greater Appalachia have a problem. I don't know why that is, but we can see it reflected in the data. This one is obesity. Same kind of patterns there. This one is life expectancy. As my project revealed in a Politico story I did last year, when we parsed life expectancy rates across the regions, we found 3 to 5 year population level differences in life expectancy between the large regions. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but that's actually the gap that separates the United States from Bulgaria, Libya, and the Philippines, respectively. And those gaps did not go away when we parsed by race, urbanity, impoverishment level of the county, education levels, or the county level of access to quality health care. This, from the Washington Post, are FICO credit scores by county. Blue is bad, gold is good. Now bear in mind, there are lots of incredibly rich counties in that big blue blob, and there's some really, really poor ones in the gold one, like Washington County, the easternmost one in Maine, which has the lowest per capita income in the entire Northeast. Even within states, compare Metro Cleveland with Metro Cincinnati, suburbs and all. Little appreciated is how much the incidence of gun violence, like so many salient issues in American life, varies by region. Here, also using CDC data, we mapped the per capita rate for gun deaths by county between 2010 and 2020 cumulative. The Deep South's annual rate of 15.6 gun deaths per 100,000 residents is about double that of Yankeedom, that greater New England space I described, and 4 times that of the Dutch settled area around New York City, whose rate of 3.8 per 100,000 isn't much higher than that of Switzerland. The gaps, by the way, persist or even grow wider if you look at just urban gun deaths, or just rural ones, or just suicides, or just white victim, or just black victim. This was a subject of another Politico story I wrote that became their most read story on their site of the year 2023. Now, when I've shown this map on the internet, the thread typically fills up with trolling comments that amount to, oh, this is just a map of where African-American people live. Because African-American gun homicide rates are typically a decimal place higher than for whites, although the gun suicide rate is half that of the white rate. But to dispel the notion that there's not regional effects at play behind that, here is exactly the same exercise, but for whites-only gun deaths. You can see here that the Deep South's rate is more than double that of Yankeedom's and 5 times that of New Netherlands. Not unrelated, on the next slide, here's every fatal white supremacist mob action in the United States between 1835 and 1964, both lynchings and riots, as mapped by the Monroe Work Today research group. You can see here the orange dots are each representing an incident where an African American was killed, the yellow ones are Latino victims. And as I said, there was a caste and Jim Crow-like system created in El Norte during the sort of occupation period, if you will. All of this also affected the distribution of religious traditions. Here, from the association, it affected, you can say, keep that slide, it profoundly affected 19th century immigration. This, from the Census Bureau, is the percentage of foreign-born people in each county in 1900. So, height of the great immigrant wave of the 1870s through 1924. Notice that nobody from that wave went to the Deep South, Tidewater, or Greater Appalachia. You're seeing 1%, right? At the same time, in New Netherlands, left coast and Yankeedom were 23-30% foreign-born in that time period. In other words, this immigration wave further increased the identity and demographic differences between these regional cultures. Which then brings us to the effect on religious traditions. Here from the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies U.S. Religion Census are the dominant religions in each county today. Red is Southern Baptist. There's a green Methodist belt going through the Midlands, which again, Gettysburg is a part of. Gray is Mormon, and blue is Catholic, the largest religious group amid that great 1870s to 1924 immigration wave that so profoundly changed ideas about American identity, forcing legacy Protestant America to accept, unwillingly and through a great struggle, that henceforth Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, at least, would be full-fledged Americans. Except none of that happened in those three southern regions. That Baptist zone you see there is the legacy of the spatial maldistribution of the great immigration wave. The only part of the country today where Christian nationalism, the notion that America is rightly an evangelical Protestant nation made for evangelical Protestants, can find fertile soil. Because it's the only place you could come up with that and have it seem to make sense. It's obviously not the case in the other regions and hasn't been for 6 or 7 generations. Here is a detailed crowdsourced map of American dialects today by the internet researcher Rick Ashman, which, like many of the data sets I'm showing you now, came years after 2011 when I wrote the book. What he did is he had an internet web portal and said, hey, come to my internet web portal and record your voice saying this little script here. And then they take all and say, where are you living right now, not even where you're from, and here's your script. And then they did their linguists and git fonts and all that to categorize things. And this is what the data said. Notice that in dark blue, the dominant domains about how people talk now follow to a great degree those regional settlement bands from the 1600s and 1700s, which when you think about it, kind of makes a little bit of sense. And to my great surprise, it even had an influence on genetics. This study came out in 2017, 6 years after American Nations came out, in the journal Nature Communications. Scientists from ancestry.com, right, the people that you send a Q-tip with your nasal swab from to find out your genome profile, you find out that, hey, I'm not Lithuanian, or that man's not my father. You can also check the box that says you can use this for research, and at that time 770,000 people have done so. They took your genome and they read the entire genome, sequenced it, and they put it in a supercomputer with the other 770,000 people's genomes and tasked the supercomputer to go out and find people who were unusually related, clusters, without any other information, just the genomes out there. However, since it's ancestry.com, they also add each person's genealogy in the database. So they know that your maternal grandmother was born in this place and died in that place, and they could trace it all. So they mapped the patterns of reproductive clustering backwards. I talked to them, I interviewed them when I saw this map, because people started emailing it to me, but they hadn't heard of American Nations. That's just how it played out. And notice the degree to which those kind of patterns followed, even within states. You can see Greater Appalachia broke on 2 sides of the Appalachian Mountains. Right? Greater Appalachia, largely Scots-Irish settlement stream. The Quakers in Philadelphia had a pretty open immigration policy because, unlike the Puritans, they believed that people had an inner light. So like, hey, anyone can come here. Come on down, come to Pennsylvania, at a time when the Puritans wouldn't let anyone in and wasn't following exactly their interpretation of John Calvin's work. So lots of people did at that time. A lot of people, Scots-Irish, were leaving Ulster and the lowlands of Scotland, and they came to Pennsylvania and went to what was then the frontier, which is just a little bit further west from here to southwestern Pennsylvania, south of Pittsburgh. Westmoreland County's in, Pittsburgh's not, and down to that border. That was the heart of the Greater Appalachian cultural beginnings. And then they broke, and one group went south down the Great Wagon Road to colonize the uplands of southern states like Virginia and the future West Virginia, and North Carolina, and northern Georgia and Alabama, and on into the Ozarks, and eventually Texas Hill Country. And another stream went into Kentucky and then rafting down the Ohio River to colonize the southern parts of the lower Great Lakes states on out to Missouri and the Delta. And you can see that mapped out there. Again, American Nations is about cultural transmission, not genetics, but to my surprise, even the big decisions that many people made about, okay, who am I going to start a family with, had these implications connected with regional settlement cultures. So the point is, the divides are real, and they're persistent, and they're mattering to life today. Next slide. So that brings us to the second big question of tonight's presentation. what holds us together? What, given all that, has ever held us together? Because the regional cultures, those 6 Eastern ones anyway, wound up together in an accident of history. They came together in 1776 to face off a common threat, a change in British imperial policy that threatened to destroy their relative autonomy in each of their places, their individual political and social systems and power structures. And to stave off this threat to their local ways of doing things, they got together and formed a joint military command in the form of the Continental Army, and a treaty organization, the Continental Congress, which had to move around the map, escaping the battle lines. And miraculously, they won. And they found themselves inside something called the United States of America, except nobody knew for sure what that was. The United States had come into being as a contractual agreement, a means to an end initially for the parties involved. Nobody in the 1780s thought they had just created a nation state in the sense that Holland or Prussia or post-revolutionary France were. Everyone knew that its people lacked a shared history or religion or ethnicity. They didn't speak a unique language all their own. They hadn't occupied the continent long enough to have some sense of dwelling in some sort of mythic homeland since time immemorial, and they killed and pushed out, or were still pushing out, the very people who could make such a claim. They lacked a shared political heritage, apart from the imperial ties that they had just rebelled against. And they had no shared story of who they were and what their common purpose was. In short, they had none of the foundations of a nation state, none of the building blocks, and no story to bring and hold them together. That story had to be created decades later, starting in the 1830s, really, a story I tell in this book, Union. It's the one thing that's held us together, more or less, ever since. But that story has been contested from the outset. Today, the regional fissures are having a corrosive effect on that story, a story of shared loyalty to the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence, the inherent equality of humans, their rights to life and liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and representative self-government that makes it all happen. And when those ideals are under assault, the US has very little else to fall back on. This is a very important point. The fate of the Republic and the fate of the Federation are one and the same. If the Republic falls, the Union would collapse soon thereafter. Now, such stories, such national narratives, are required for every nation, be it Germany or Hungary or Japan or ourselves. Because as individuals, to have a fealty to something as abstract as a nation, to feel that we owe it greater loyalty than to others, that we're bound to its fellow members more than we are to people who are not members, that we might ultimately give our lives for it, that requires a very compelling and credible story, an idea that's evocative and feels true on some level, that has footings in the past and gives us an answer to why and where we're going and why we're together at all. A society without a credible story, the historian William McNeill wrote 35 years ago, soon finds itself in deep trouble. For in the absence of believable myths, coherent public action becomes very difficult to improvise or to sustain. So the story of United States nationhood, of what the country's purpose was and who belonged and where it came from and where it was going, had to be created ex post facto. And by the time we really got around to doing it, like I said, in the 1830s and 1840s, there were already 2 stories competing for each other. 2 stories of America that could not coexist. A contest over identity and purpose that has continued to this day. Now, one of those stories said, yes, we may lack a shared history or religion or ethnicity, but what we share are a set of ideals, those ones I mentioned before in that famous passage in our opening statement as a people, the Declaration of Independence. To be an American is to be committed to this set of propositions about the nature of the universe. In this tradition, first packaged and promoted by a Massachusetts Yankee, the historian statesman George Bancroft in the 1830s, argued that America's purpose was to create a society dedicated to making those ideals a reality, and that Americans' purpose was to fight for those ideals and to one another, being able to secure them. Now, these are good ideals. We'll move on to the next slide. a natural right granted to all humans by God or nature, or as the Declaration says, nature's God, to survive, to not be tyrannized, to pursue our happiness as we each understand it, and to have equal access to the representative self-government that makes it possible. And that we're in a covenant as Americans to protect one another's rights to these things. Those are the ideals that Frederick Douglass fought for in every speech he made. This is Lincoln here at Gettysburg, and Martin Luther King on the Mall. It's our civic national ideal. It's the American promise. But it was contested almost immediately from the 1830s onward by a counter-narrative, crafted by a circle of Southern intellectuals who said, no, the Declaration is wrong. Jefferson was wrong. Humans are not created equal. Only the Anglo-Saxon race, they argued, had the genius and ability to secure the promises in the Declaration. We're a classical republic, they argued, like ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where a minority had the privilege or liberty to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery are the natural lot of the many. It was ethno-nationalist and an inherently authoritarian vision. Now, the battle between these two versions of America has been our eternal historical struggle. This was the fight throughout the antebellum period, and in the Civil War, and here at Gettysburg, and Antietam this day in the Civil War, and Reconstruction. The ethno-nationalists actually ruled this country in the 1910s and 1920s, when the first deep Southern president, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the federal government. When they were putting up the Confederate statues we're now tearing down. When Birth of a Nation, this is the actual movie poster, was all the rage. A movie celebrating the Ku Klux Klan's successful terrorist campaign to restore white supremacy in the occupied South. When the 1924 Immigration Act imposed racial quotas explicitly to defend the Anglo-Saxon character of the country. The civic national vision only triumphed federation-wide in the 1960s, the result of the mass mobilizations in the world wars, the civil rights movements, those returning African Americans and Native Americans and Latino vets helped spearhead, and the interventions of the federal government at key moments because the existence of a formal racial apartheid regime in the American South was providing the Soviets with powerful propaganda to win the hearts and minds of people in the primary battlefield of the Cold War, what we now call the Global South, and was then called the Third World. And so the civil rights movement toppled Southern apartheid and challenged Northern racism. The feminist movement demanded social, professional, and sexual equality for a gender that comprised the majority of the population. Gays and lesbians fought the police and discriminatory ordinances. Elite colleges began partially dismantling their old boys networks, and public universities rapidly expanded to increase educational opportunities. Congress passed a new immigration law in 1964 that repealed the ethno-national quotas, reopening America's gates to humanity at large. And a new generation of historians challenged the neo-Confederate narrative of American history that had by then dominated scholastic textbooks for half a century, while dispelling the innocence of the American colonization of the continent. And so, the civic national narrative returned to the fore. And that's when we became what political scientists would call a liberal democracy, small l, small d, not in the 1860s, in the 1960s, in living memory. That's why it's an incredible gift. It's had to be fought for, and continues to have to be fought for. Because the forces of autocracy and ethno-nationalism are on the march, and they have their narrative, their story of the kind of country they're fighting for, all worked out. Make America great again, like it was before that civic national triumph. The rest of us don't have our story worked out. And by the rest of us, I mean the 70 to 80% of Americans who actually, when confronted with the idea of it, don't want to live in an authoritarian world. We've lost our story, our message. And we were never really very good at talking about it at all. What do those civic ideals in the Declaration really mean in practice? What's a natural right to the pursuit of happiness means? But we stopped trying to altogether after the Cold War, and a vacuum opened up, and demagogues stepped right in, as they often do. We need that story now. not only because democracy really is better than dictatorship, but also because the consolidation of an ethno-nationalist authoritarian regime would almost certainly trigger the physical collapse of this federation. Hungary, where I lived for many years, will still exist whether they have an ethno-national regime or not. The country's identity is not tied into that problem. That is not true of us. And that's the work we're doing at Nationhood Lab right now. The testing and polling and crafting of an emotive, weaponized American story that answers to why we should stay together and why we all belong and where we're going, but one that can be used in ordinary conversations and in real-world situations. One that can rally that latent supermajority to defend what should have been America's ideals for all of these past 248 years. We're perfecting that story right now, a story of pride and reckoning, of an effort to create a society where all people can be meaningfully free. And we'll be helping to deploy it by putting it in the hands of organizations working to reform civic education, to engage Hollywood producers and television showrunners to bring some of these themes into their creative mix, to help business leaders grapple with what values their institutions really can't do without, to political leaders, Republicans, Democrats, independents, or whatever, so long as they share a commitment to the American experiment, to organizations working to field and protect the vote, like the 700 chapters for League of Women Voters, to the 250th anniversary commissions. The country and the Declaration turned 250 in 2026. Those commissions in each of the 50 states tasked with helping commemorate the anniversary of the country and the Declaration itself, and in the hands of all of you. We're a public library shelf. Now we're in the midst of polling and qualitative work. We're concluding all of it, bringing all the polls and surveys together and crunching down our final product, which should be out in a month or so. Our preliminary national baseline poll we completed in April had really encouraging results. We asked registered voters which statements about the nature of the United States they most agreed with. We offered statement pairs about our national purpose, American identity, and the meaning of our past. And in each case, one of the statements was keyed off the ideals in the Declaration, but not saying that. The other was rooted in more intrinsic characteristics, like ancestry, heritage, and character versions of who we're supposed to be. Now, I thought that, writing each of them be as attractive as possible, that the heritage and character versions would actually win out, if only because they seemed more concrete and less sort of abstract loyalty to some kind of, ideas out there in the ether. But when we get the polling results back, the civic ones proved far more attractive, and did so regardless of gender, age, race, education, or American nation's regional culture. 63% of Americans preferred the statement that we were united not by a shared religion, ancestry, or history, but by our shared commitment to a set of American founding ideals, that we all have inherent and equal rights to live, not be tyrannized, and pursue happiness as we each understand it, over an alternate narrative embraced by only 33% of respondents that said we were united by shared history, traditions, and values, and by our fortitude and character as Americans, a people who value hard work, individual responsibility, and national loyalty. Now, I put some of the crosstabs up here. I don't know if you can read them, but green is preference for the civic version, yellow for the heritage ethno-nationalist constructions in those two statement pairs I just gave you. The former, the civic version, was the overwhelming favorite for most everybody, based gender, education level, age, and so on, except for two major exceptions, Republicans and those who voted for Trump in 2020. But still, 45% of respondents from both of those segments preferred the civic ideals in the Declaration, joining 63% of independents and 79% of self-identified Democrats. Now, as a starting point, before we even begin working on some kind of messaging magic, those were very encouraging numbers. Just last week, we completed the last round of polling, and we're digesting that. But you get to hear, you'd be the first people in the world to hear the results from that, because when I was working earlier today to send out our press release, MailChimp's formatting functions for sending mail are incredibly frustrating and will be delayed till tomorrow. So you have the world premiere. The first, we want to test if Americans agree with the argument, grounded in a logic-based analysis of the Declaration, that we're duty-bound as Americans to protect one another's natural rights to life and liberty and all the rest. We had no data on that. Do people really think that? I mean, I think that's what the Declaration says, but do people buy it? And they do, by an incredible 97-2 margin. The widest margin our pollster had ever seen in any question they posed on any poll. So, people say that they believe in the Declaration's values and to each other being able to secure them, that you should actively help each other secure them. So, they believe in liberal democracy. But do they actually act on these beliefs when the going gets tough? We were wondering that. Talk is cheap, actions matter. So we asked a series of questions in this new poll about real-world scenarios in which these natural rights propositions are clearly under assault. When it came to aggressive book bans, governments trying to force public libraries, not school libraries, public libraries, to remove titles that some people found offensive under the threat of funding cuts or eviction of the library from a public building, everybody was opposed. Same, broadly speaking, for election subversion, for a scenario in which somebody was refusing to certify a fraud-free election because their party lost. Though in both cases, you can see the breakdown by party. You can see that Republican opposition to those things is a bit softer, significantly a bit softer on that. And then there's this one. The top slide, people were asked, hey, are you okay with lawmakers from your party eliminating election day voter registration explicitly because they believe it will suppress turnout for the other party's supporters? This is in fact happened with lawmakers saying that's why they're doing it. Now overall, 61% of Americans strongly or somewhat oppose this. But look at those partisan splits. Republicans actually supported the partisan vote suppression argument by an 8-point margin. Independents oppose it by 36, and Democrats by 77 points. And the bottom slide asks, hey, are you okay with the Supreme Court decision saying that presidents are above the law, that they can't be held accountable for crimes they say were an official act? Justice Sotomayor, as you might know under dissent in the case, noted that under this definition, ordering SEAL Team 6 to assassinate your political opponents would be okay because it would be an official act. Republicans support this ruling 67-16, a staggering 51-point margin. Democrats oppose it by a nearly universal 93-3, a 90-point margin, joined by independents with a 29-point margin. Now there's an instance where, because the Supreme Court decision applies to any president in theory, but because it was Trump versus United States, a lot of people see that in a partisan lens. And look what happens immediately when you see one team or the other involved, how much get those splits. So there's a lot of work to be done, is what I'm saying, especially on the American right. And thus our work on perfecting an effective message, that compelling story of civic nationhood. And we're working on optimizing that language right now with all the lessons and qualitative interviews and everything we've done to roll out at the beginning of next year ahead of the 250th. Now you might say, hey, you're never going to convince everyone. Well, that's true. There's 10 or 20% of Americans who really are all in, not just for a heritage and tradition and character kind of interpretation of America, but for full ethno-national authoritarianism. It's true, polling and stuff suggests in every culture, there's about that percentage of humans who are sort of predisposed to that and can be actualized across the world in studies, can be actualized when the context comes up. People who genuinely relish the public promises of their leader to assign active duty military forces to domestic law enforcement duties, to pardon convicted insurrectionists and other criminals en masse, to investigate and jail critics and political rivals on invented charges, to purge the civil service and staff it with people whose loyalty is to the leader, not the people or the country or the law, to use the Insurrection Act to crush protesters, a world where reporters, public officials, election workers, and anyone who's regarded as a danger are physically threatened or even attacked on the behest of the leadership. A world where elections will no longer be settled by voters, but by the machinations of the regime. The 10 or 20% who genuinely support that agenda will in fact reject the narrative I propose because they do reject the American experiment. And it's true that many others won't want to listen or hear, committed to their tribal identity, to the safety and comfort of an information bubble, or the love of their leader. But some will. And my argument is that to protect democracy in the next few years, in a country poised on a knife edge, shifting 5 or 7% of those asleep at the wheel, unaware of the stakes and the threat, would be decisive for the survival of the democracy. And in the middle and long term, I think the wind is at our backs, the backs of that omnipartisan, anti-authoritarian majority. Because I have Gen Alpha kids, and their generations, and Gen Z, and the millennials, are not on board for any of this. Our poll, as well as many others, showed this. Huge generational gaps on every single one of these questions. And as their electoral power rapidly grows in the coming decade, that threat to our country will recede, and we can move on to addressing all of these core problems that got us there in the first place. And so, I invite you to follow our work as it continues to unfold, nationhoodlab.org, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you. Who would like to be first? Don't be shy. Hand up somewhere. Yes, sir.
So, one of the things I've been learning is that when you're polling, one of the things that I learned is as you're polling, you have to be aware of what you're actually asking to get an accurate answer.
Yeah.
With the inherent rights that you polled, you had such strong numbers for, did you take into account the fact that different sides may have different interpretations of what an inherent right is and how that might affect their answers?
Well, we listed the question. You can see it if you go to the website and see the methodology statements and see all the scripts that everyone's answered. Yeah, the answer to those. The question explicitly said, the Declaration says that people have a natural right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Do you believe that we as Americans are required to, are obligated to protect one another's rights to these things? That one another was italicized. So the question, we know what rights we're talking about. Now, do different people think that each of those natural rights means something different? Absolutely. Thus, we've got a bunch of polling understanding that. We did qualitative interviews. We had one-on-one interviews that are posted with people talking about, the Declaration says this. What do you think that means? It had the whole script to get at that, and we selected people from all different representative demographics. So we have a ton of information about that, and yeah, people think about it in different ways, but I would say the overall message is that they're not as far apart as you think in the end. You get wings that are way out there. Again, there's a 10 or 20% who are, not into the American experiment at all and disagree with it. The other thing is what's the imminent threat to natural liberty? I think it's this, and you think it's that, and they'll send you off in different directions. But the point is, if you get the guardrails, and the conversation is about, okay, how do we further an experiment in everyone being free, and we've got this problem, how do you deal with this issue? You can look at it this way, but you're already operating within the constraints of how do we create a more free society that works? That's different than we're going to throw out elections and, storm capitals and shoot our enemies kind of thing, right? So that conversation is a totally legitimate conversation, but the whole goal is that you're framing it around the American experiment. And that's, for that whole conversation. The whole individual liberty, common good thing is a legitimate argument we've been having for, 250, 300 years. But as of late, you stopped having that conversation, became Republic or to heck with that now. Right? So that's the broad picture. But I'll have a better answer when we finish digesting all of the data to summarize it.
The example that I had in mind is if you discuss healthcare, most people on the left would argue that everybody should have a right to healthcare. But then arguments that I frequently encounter from friends and family that I have on the right is that nobody has a right to the labor of another individual. And so the argument there is which inherent right would either supersede or is equal and so on and so forth. So that's why I asked specifically about that.
Yeah, that's a question about the role of government, society, the common good versus individual liberty. The extreme individual liberty and extreme common good both lead to tyranny. That's why they're bad and extreme, right? One leads to, Orwell, and the other leads to Guatemala and 10 families, right? If there's really no constraints and we all live in a happy libertarian-ish proto-anarchy, the most powerful families will maximize their freedom and crush everybody else, and that's what gets you an oligarchy. Oligarchy or Orwell, let's not have either, right? So if the two extremes lead there, logically that means somewhere there's a balance point where the two are in like their maximally optimized condition. Every society has a different balance point. Japan's is going to be different from ours, different from the UK. But our problem is the regional cultures are wildly different, right? So that's all legitimate conversation. But yeah, there's going to be an argument about all kinds of issues. Healthcare, the gun issue, the COVID vaccine. Those are classic individual liberty versus common good issues. Right? Wearing a mask, closing your business, those all really mess with individual liberty. But if you don't do it, somebody you don't know is going to die. Although it's like safety of the community versus freedom of the individual in classic form. Same with gun rights of the gun owner versus safety of the community, right? Those are individual liberty, common good things. The regional cultures have opposite polling responses. Right? Where I'm from, Maine's a huge gun owning state. My old high school at Pell, everyone went deer hunting. But in Maine, you ask people, including gun owners, hey, what's more important? Safety of the community, rights of the gun owner. It's like 60-40 safety of the community. And you ask the same question in greater Appalachia, doppelganger counties, it's flipped. It's 40-60 the other way, right? It's a different individual liberty, common good balance point. But kind of figure out a way that a federation can find a balance point together on those big issues.
Hi, my name is Sam Levine, and for the last 3 years I've worked with the National Park Service on the front lines of history in America, both at Antietam, which is our 162nd anniversary today, and here in Gettysburg at Eisenhower National Historic Site. Now, as a government agency, we're privileged with the ability to be able to tell the American story to the world. But being bound by the Hatch Act, we operate with the understanding that we are an apolitical agency, despite the fact that a lot of our work is inherently political, whether to the politics of the era and its rhymes with today. And a lot of what we've talked about at Eisenhower this year, in accordance with the 80th anniversary of the start of the Great Crusade to liberate Europe, is working with international partners and getting people to buy into that idea of America. Now, it is a really good day at the office for me when I get somebody to realize the rhymes between the 1940s and 50s with today, in terms of getting people to buy into America and the problems that we face then and now, which are very similar. Do you think that getting people to buy into these abstractions about America can happen in elementary school classrooms? Because I realized in the polling data that you showed, a lot of these people that buy into the idea of the American experiment are college educated. So do you think that there's a way that we can get a jump start on that to help promote empathy within our society?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that civic education disappeared from most public school curricula in the generation when we entered the democratic crisis. It's no longer something that people learn. Even I'm a Gen Xer. In my generation, we had to learn the branches of government and the basic tenets of the Declaration in a sort of structured way before we could finish middle school or whatever it was. And that's not really the case anymore. Yeah, if you don't know those basic things, if you dropped all that because it's not on the standardized test or whatever, it has knock-on effects. I also think the fact that all of this is happening when the generation who remembers World War II and the fight against Nazism is no longer here, right? And suddenly humans don't live that long. We tend to forget the lessons we learned before. So yeah, I think all of those things are true. And civic education partners, Regina, who's Institute for Citizens and Scholars, I think he was your last speaker in this particular series, is working on the civic education front. We're talking about, helping provide what we learn and how to talk about this stuff as fodder that they may use in understanding how to frame whatever they're going to do in the details of recommended civic education curriculum reform. So yeah, there's a lot of partners who are specializing. We're trying to kind of provide for a Star Trek reference, the dilithium crystal to power other people's work so they can go to war 8 instead of war 4. That's kind of what we're doing because we can create the dilithium crystals. The deployment is going to require partners who are specialized in all kinds of different fields out there in the world.
So earlier in your presentation, you referenced the Make America Great Again movement.
Yeah.
Was your, just to clarify, was your point that the movement intends to move the country back to before protections existed for marginalized groups? Is that what you were saying?
It is not explicitly saying so, but the evocative messaging is coded in that direction. That something has been lost in the past, and it's sort of a vague, 50s, before the 60s, and everything went awry, things were better, and society was more worried, we're gonna make us great again like we were then. There's often references back to that time period, and it followed, it's not something that came new, this comes out of a very long narrative arc developed for decades in certain quarters that means that. Is it intentionally come out and say, no, we're not about protections? No, but it's celebrating an era where none of those things had happened yet. There's a messaging is about emotion sometimes more than logic, and it pulls back to that emotional spot. There's a tendency to respond to people who are upset about that rather than maybe benefiting from the fact that those changes happen.
So you kind of ended the,
Oh, there you are.
like your kind of final note was like very like optimistic. I feel kind of talking about Gen Alpha, Gen Z,
Yeah.
kind of they tend to skew more left. They kind of tend to skew more towards the civil liberties argument. But then like right before that, you were talking about not saying it explicitly, but a lot of like Trump policies, a lot of policy finding Project 2025. So I guess I'm asking like how inevitable do you think that Gen Z, Gen Alpha kind of re-emergence of civil liberties are, and do you think that like that kind of survives, like if Trump wins in November, and those policies do go into place, like replacing civil service people or
Yeah, those are all declared policies even before Project 2025 surfaced. Those are all things that were promised by former President Trump on the campaign trail. So, I take him at his word that he would like to do those things and would try to implement them. So those are not, none of those things are in accordance with the values in the Declaration. So that's problematic if you're concerned about maintaining the American experiment. Well, I would hope not, but yeah. Now, polling numbers and stuff, yeah, I think that the younger generations are strongly against that. I wouldn't describe it as civil liberties, but as a civic vision for what the country is supposed to be, not tied to the sort of heritage and ethno-nationalist components and stuff don't work as well with younger generations as a group than they do with the older generations. So I think that's sticking in most political science now. I mean, people get more conservative as they get older. Yeah, they sort of do, but in general, when people come of age, where they stand on the political spectrum, is kind of there's a lot of inertia to that. A generation doesn't drift too far off from that. I'm a Gen Xer. All the age groups you see in the polling, we're the most conservative group of all, especially men. But we came of age at a time at the ascendancy of Reagan and conservatism. That was like the thing, and the country was prosperous. Most people in my generation who were young were conservative and Republican leaning, which is totally the opposite of today, because the generation now is growing up in a completely different circumstance. So it's more like, what was your generation, what was happening in the world and your generation experiencing when you were, 18 to 24, seems to have a pretty lasting effect on that generational cohort's future stance in politics. It applied to the silent generation and to baby boomers and so on. So yeah, more conservative over time, but starting with completely different starting points. Yes, sir.
I want to follow up on this question and go a step further on where Trump is going. And part of what I see is that he's talking about replacing income taxes with tariffs, and he talks about going back to the 1880s. And you take a look and compare that part of our history to where we are today, and do you think that's really kind of a second derivation of where he wants to go? Because when you think about that, you really, it's individualism. Anybody that creates money gets to keep their own money. If you do away with income tax and you go to a pure mercantile society, that has great implications for our society.
So there's a movement that has explicitly idealized the 1880s that predates Trump, and its core ideas. It's the Mises, Libertarian Cato Institute. Some of the tech people like Peter Thiel are fans of that. And yeah, it's the argument that we go back to a time. Yeah, the individual liberty argument. All this government is bad. If we had less regulation and less taxes and everything would be better. And returning to the 1880s. I covered that in American Character. What were the 1880s actually like? My reading of history is that did not turn out very well, and it ended in the 1924 stock market crash that compelled all those things. But let's set it aside as a policy argument. Your question is, is President Trump going to go in that direction? I know he said that. That's not, I don't think, really something that he's personally deeply invested in one way or the other. In 2016, when I do my American Nations talk, it analyzed the election results, 2016 compared to 2012, Mitt Romney, classic, normal establishment Republican compared to Trump. Where did Trump make gains in those elections to win an election when the series of Republican candidates have lost before? And how? And the key is he made his gains in getting that electoral college victory because on the campaign trail, President Trump, candidate Trump, was promising to be the most communitarian candidate of any Republican nominee since Nixon or maybe Eisenhower. He was going to replace Obamacare with something better and cheaper. He was going to reinvigorate the Rust Belt manufacturing that had been lost through neglect and sometimes bad policy, but something that would require the fiat and scale of the New Deal-like program. The federal government was going to somehow reverse that. And so on. They were big communitarian promises. And what you saw was in rural parts of Yankee and the Midlands, he got massive shifts in those places and not really anywhere else. The rest of the map is pretty much the same as like a Romney, Romney-Obama race in 2012. And that was enough to tip, and the electoral college map, or where it takes all, is to tip some of those blue wall states over to his column. Did he do any of those things in office? No, he didn't really do any of those things. And those places kind of flipped back in 2020 and sort of cost him the election. So what I'm saying is, on the communitarian individual liberty spectrum, I don't think that that's what Trump personally cares about, that whole argument per se at all. I think people around him would like him to say those things. I didn't have him say those things, but we'll have to wait and see. I have more of a sense of the questions about ethno-nationalism versus authoritarian, ethno versus civic nationalism with him than the individual communitarian thing, which I think is not, super invested in one way or the other. So it could go any way depending on who's around him and has his ear.
A question up here in the middle.
Yes.
Yeah, I just had a question regarding the survey.
Yeah.
About the two questions that you posed about and Democrats and Republicans having like really differing opinions.
And on the last slides,
Yeah, those two.
yeah.
Yeah, I was curious. That sample size was relatively small. Like it was like 2,000 to 3,000, was it?
That's pretty, for a national poll, it was 2,700. That's a big national poll, yeah.
Okay.
If you go look on, like the polling aggregate sites for national polls on, Harris versus Trump, I mean, a lot of the national polls are N equals 1,000 or 1,500. That's actually a relatively big one. And it gives you, if you're trying to get nationwide, you're not trying to like sort by a particular state, that's pretty robust results.
I guess
Usually people say, yeah.
You can do that if you're trying to get, like, if you're trying to generalize, you can use that sample size. Like, if my
that gets you, I mean, I'm not a pollster, but the pollsters we hire who know this stuff, that gives you excellent confidence for not only the overall national result and the parties, which are big N sizes, N equals 900 or 1,000 or something for each of those things, but you can go down into not only male, female, race, age groups by generation and education, you can actually with confidence cross those. So you can with confidence have a result with like a 3% margin of error for Hispanic women or for high school educated men. So you can actually do those things down to that level. It's not super high grade. Where you need big sample sizes like N equals 10,000 is if you want to start segmenting down really. The more you segment down, those N equals, the number of people you're dealing with get smaller and smaller. That's why you need a big poll. If you're just trying to say nationally how do people feel, yeah, 2,700 is a really robust poll. Again, we got all that stuff, once I get the press release out, you can go to the methodology statements and read all the actual questions and dig behind them.
Question.
Yes.
Hi, my question is about the South and the future of the South electorally. So you mentioned earlier, like each part of settlement, it tends to be pretty culturally conservative.
Yeah,
The
there's
South,
three, I mean, what's the South? There are two or three, depending where you want to put the Appalachian, but yeah.
well, then later on, your detail was they receive maybe like 1% of European
The deep
immigration.
South and Taiwan are about 1.2 and 1.1, yeah, almost nothing. We have today's slide though, I didn't show it now, but it's a fascinating change now.
Well, yeah, I mean, I kind of want to talk about that change because, like, you have the bulk of ethnic diversity in the Democratic electorate, with the Republican electorate remaining primarily white. So goes to show that it's a Republican stronghold now. But now you have the most migration within the United States going southward, going westward. I'm wondering, where do you see the Republican Party adapting on this front, especially considering they may have to widen their coalition?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, briefly, yeah, people are moving around, and a lot of people say, hey, you know, if so many people are moving around the country, and a lot of people are moving from the north up here where it's cold, and going to the south, in other words, from blue states to red states, shouldn't everything be getting more purple? Should the red states be getting more blue? Except the opposite is happening. Like those red states, like Florida's getting redder, right? And Wisconsin's not, you know, turning bluer. You know, what's up with that? The answer is that as social scientists looked at who's moving, when you're asking political questions like who these people resemble, it turns out that on average, people who are moving around resemble their destination, not their point of origin. In other words, you know, in every single county, we have the full range of opinion. It just is the dominant ethos on one side or the other. If you're born in a place, you're like, you know, oh, this frustrates me. I was born here, and all these people have these, you know, unexamined assumptions. It makes me nuts. They think X and Y are true. Obviously, if they're true. I know that people in other parts of the country believe A and B. If my company ever let me move, I would go somewhere where people believe A and B, and they do if they had a chance. And people are self-sorting and making the map more clean because the people are voting with their feet to go where they feel they belong. So that's in part what's actually happening with some of the shifts in people. What does that mean for, if I were a Republican strategist, if we continue having democratic elections, all the demography and all the numbers and stuff, yeah, it's not a winning strategy to have your present coalition. It's not going to work out in the middle term or even the shortish term. So yeah, you've got to broaden the strategy. What would I do? I mean, it's not my task, but you know, George W. Bush saw that El Norte, broadly speaking, in the Southwest, right? What is El Norte's, you know, fundamental culture? If it were in Europe, it would be Christian democratic, like center right. Here's people who are entrepreneurial, go to church a lot, family's important. It's like your classic, you know, Christian Democrats in Europe kind of party. There isn't a Christian Democrats in Europe kind of party available here. And George W. Bush, when he was governor of Texas, was going for that. He was, you know, knew that it was possible to win over a much larger portion of Mexican-American vote, at least, by going in that direction. That's not where his party ended up going, right? And for sort of racial, ethno-nationalist identity things started making people feel like they weren't welcome there, people who would be natural allies. Could a future center-right party dominate El Norte and the fastest growing demographic out there? Absolutely, but it would have to be a different variety of conservatism than we have right now. And the country needs it, right? You cannot have, especially in a two-party system, only one like functioning small d democratic party. You got to have two, because what will happen very quickly if you have a one-party state, and a lot of our states are one-party states, they turn corrupt and unresponsive to the rest of us. You can see democratic machine politics, you can see Republican machine politics. It's not a good situation. You need a competitive environment with two healthy parties committed to the American experiment. So I hope that someone comes up with that coalition, but it cannot be an ethno-national authoritarian one because, I mean, beyond the morality, I think that's immoral and counter to the American experiment, but it's also a loser just in self-interest, as long as you're expecting to have free and fair elections where people get to vote.
Question up at the top here.
Yes, please.
Going back to your comment about the Supreme Court decision that provides for presidential immunity for any official act, I see that as an extreme threat to the American experiment. What is your thinking about that particular issue, and how do we as Americans who want the American experiment to survive counter what's happening with our Supreme Court at this point?
Right. I agree that it's a threat. That decision is not a good one. You know, in theory, applies to any president. You think a president, anything they consider an official act is beyond the law. Is that a healthy status? That's like kingly response, right? The whole idea is that we don't have kings. You know, an ex-president is nothing. It's a citizen, just like the rest of us. So you know, that's a very dangerous place to go. And it's because the deterioration of our liberal democracy, the Supreme Court has already deteriorated to the point where a lot of decisions that are made are shockers to anybody who's followed constitutional law. They're coming out of the blue, and they often appear to be partisan self-interest, which is not what we want a Supreme Court to be doing. That, right? That part of our government is already being captured, and so it's really important that there be a pushback. What do you do about that? There's no easy solutions. We have a system, and I would say this is showing some of the flaws and the genius of the 1787 Constitution. Right? The Declaration was our opening statement as a people in our business plan. This is the purpose of the country. The Constitution, the first one didn't work out well, they dropped the second one. That's like a plan for how to operationalize it. Okay, we have this mission statement, how do we go out there and have a plan to actually do this? And it was a compromise agreement to keep the Deep South and Tidewater in the coalition. And it betrays the Declaration's targets in all kinds of ways. We're still living with that. It incorporates elements of aristocracy, right? Elements of a church as the first estate in the States General. Right? We have some people who read the Holy Scriptures and interpret them who are appointed for life. And it's kind of a weird idea in a liberal democracy, right? And we're seeing the shortcomings of creating a system like that. So, in the long term, the policy fixes are maybe we should have Supreme Court justices for a 12-year term or something like that, and have them on a rotating basis so that they won't coincide with any particular presidency normally. And you have a clean rotation and circuit of offices. And then people who are 99 years old aren't on the court anymore. You don't have to worry about them deciding to retire. That's all good for the republic. Those are all things that have to get through a filibustered Senate as well. But that's the path. And you could start far enough out where no one can game out whether that politics are going to work for this party or that party. Just have to be good public policy. But yeah, that's a whole other set of questions as to how do you fix things that are already being broken.
I had a question in regards to the American identity that you spoke about. You said that the American identity is constructed from a multitude of nations, especially during the 19th century. And I was wondering if you could speak a little on the role that commerce in between these different societies, these different types of class societies, the role that the finance capital of New York played, and the interaction between the Midwest and the industrial heartland, and sort of Yankee, and the way that commerce and trade and economic interrelation play into building the identity.
Yeah, all of that is. Believe it or not, what an incredible success this odd federation had, right? Becoming a world powerhouse in all sorts of ways, including that economic relationships you described. Broadly speaking, though, for much of our history, the two models were resource extraction in the South. The far West treated as an internal resource colony by exterior, the Hearsts, Anaconda Copper, federal government. We're going to loot this place, and people are going to gather resources and we're going to drag off to the other regional cultures. And the manufacturing, processing, higher-end centers were taking place in Midlands, New Netherlands, and Yankee. And that was the model that the leadership, the political leadership in each region, was on board for that arrangement. And it extended all kinds of things, right? Who was moving the slaves in the slave trade before it was ended? Yankee New England merchants, right? Who brought the first slaves to all these colonies? The Dutch. Everybody had economic incentives at different levels, but broadly speaking, you had, plantation-based, low-wage, we want to control labor supply, and we'll do it with slaves or indentured servants or whatever we have to do. Plantation system, creating raw resources that would be shipped to northern mills or to Manchester and British mills, one model, and then the manufacturing centers drawing in immigrant labor who were fueling the creation and expansion of industry and railroads and everything else. So that was the general relationships. They caused links and cohesion, but as we've seen in the way history played out, not enough as of yet to bond the country together.
Any other questions?
Yes, so do you think that the differences between states, such as values and mentality, affect democracy in the U.S.?
Yes, absolutely. And not only because those different stances on individual liberty versus common good argument means that they're in disagreement about any fundamental policy question comes up. What's the best way to solve this? Less regulation, less government, or new programs and more government to solve it, right? The Yankees want to go utopian, create something better, and the others are like, you're taking away freedom by having the government take over things that individuals should be doing. And that's gonna come up in huge numbers of things and cause political friction, and that's what's happened. So, yeah, in all sorts of ways. Not to mention, having a race-based slave and then caste system enforced by deadly violence of the law. I mean, that's a big thing for any country to recover from, to have that be an aspect of your supposedly liberal democratic freedom achieving experiment.
Yes, I have a follow-up question for you then. But the US is federation, which means that people are free to choose the state that they want to live in, and this can also, therefore they can support the policy that they want, right? And
Laboratories of
yes, but
fill in the blank.
doesn't it mean that it only reinforces the democracy, creating the competition between different states?
Theoretically, that's the hope of the laboratories of democracy element, that different states will try out, test drive different policies. And yeah, a lot of innovation has come from that. But there are certain things, there are a lot of things that you can't have separate state regimes on and not have the whole be jeopardized. The Fugitive Slave Act was a classic one. These states say we're going to enslave human beings, these states say you don't, but then the fact that people might run away to the other, and we want our laws imposed where you have to go return this enslaved person or estate to you under penalty of criminal action against you. And suddenly, citizens in non-slave areas were being asked to enforce slavery personally. Right? That was one of the biggest corrosive effects, because you couldn't have those big differences that huge in the civil rights of humans contained in the same legal regime of one polity. Yeah, you got a federal government, but you got a state governments, but overarching, you're allowed to move around. There's a lot of things like that. If you really do take a draconian stance on reproductive rights and start saying that women in your state can't cross state lines to access something that is legal in another state, how do you contain that within one federation where your civil and human rights vary depending on what state you're resident on? The laboratories can only experiment so far before they start destroying the university or the building that they're housed in. The delta can't get too big and still hold it together.
So I'm sort of interested in the historical side of things. Could you talk more about, based on your regional research, about the party switch that you had mentioned earlier, but I think you kind of had to gloss over it a little bit.
Oh yeah.
Just for time.
Yeah, right. In history and political science, this is well known, but I gave a talk to 25 U.S. senators in the Capitol, and it became clear to me from the questions that many of the U.S. senators who've been elected governors and stuff didn't know this background either. But yeah, basic fundamental thing in American political history is the party's reverse polarity over 60 years. So the Republican Party was originally the party of Yankeedom, basically. It was founded in upstate Wisconsin. It was the vehicle for Abraham Lincoln and the abolitionists and the communitarian experiment on having a strong federal government. And all of that stuff was all housed under the Republican label and provoked the Civil War. And at that time, the Democratic Party was the party of immigrants in the big machine cities and the Southern oligarchy and planter slave castes and the Dixiecrats and all the rest. And that was true explicitly. I mean, no one would have argued with you if you went back to 1950 and asked them in the political story. And then, over the big accelerant point was when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. And he said to the lawyers, I think I've just lost the South to the Democratic Party for, 2 generations. It's wrong, it's like 4 generations. But yeah, that was one of the accelerants that pushed a shift that caused a reversing of polarity. It took a little while, it took a few decades for the entire polarity. Like, it took a while for West Virginia to realize that they were now a red state. They just finally, Manchin just left, Jim Justice switched over, but that was one of the last proceedings because the unionism of West Virginia was so large. Right? The Republican identity back to the Civil War. Here's a place, Greater Appalachia was on the Union side of the Civil War. Not because they cared about slavery, they hated the planter oligarchy, which the people were in the individual liberty and this sort of aristocratic class, they hated them and they aligned with the Union. So Western Virginia broke off from the rest of Virginia to stay in the Union. That's a pretty strong Republican stance. Same with Maine. Maine was like a one-party Republican state tied back to the Civil War, abolitionism and all the rest. And it took a while for that sort to take place, but now we're totally sorted. So you can look at a map from early in the 20th century, and you can look at a map from recent election, and they're more or less the same map with the flip. You can see the Western Reserve of Ohio on those maps and all of the rest. So it's, yeah.
As a follow-up,
And then just briefly, it's because so we're trying to read the tea leaves and what your coalition should be next. Because the Nixon administration, a guy named Kevin Phillips was a John Nixon strategist, and he created the Southern strategy. It's like, hey, in the South, Southern whites are really upset about the end of segregation and Brown versus Ford. There's a chance for us there. Let's go into what had been a Democratic place and peel off voters. And that was an intentional strategy, and it worked.
so as a follow-up, you talked about Bush and the El-Norte region.
Yeah.
Do you think that if there's a little bit of a shift in the Republican Conservative Party, that maybe decades and decades from now, obviously this is very far in the future and hypothetical, but do you think that there could initiate another party switch if ideologies sort of
I
switch
mean,
up a
if
little
history
bit?
is any guide, sure. Right? I mean, the lesson here is you can't understand American political history through a partisan lens, try to track the Democrats as Democrats, Republicans were, because they switch. Now, other parties go away. Where are the Federalists now? What happened to the Jeffersonian Democrats? What happened to the Whigs? They disappeared, another party took their place, and parties can reverse polarity. But the regional fissures and the ideologies behind them are the consistent pattern. Could you, 30 years from now, have two completely different parties running the show? Or one party go away and be replaced by another, or rebranding, or flipping the constituencies? Sure, any of that happens, because the short-term political consultants are, how do we win the next election? Oh, we should say this and do this. Oh, okay, well, you fast forward 30 years and you've moved so far in this direction in pursuit of voters, and the other party's like, oh, we can pick up these people they left behind. You can have them switch spots, which is kind of what happened. But yeah, any of that's possible, and you can have realignments of all sorts.
One final question.
This is interesting. Have you heard of the 1790s Nationalization Acts?
Is that the ones where they proclaimed that only white people could be United States citizens?
Basically,
Yeah.
so only white landowning, males could vote. What does that say about, the foundation of our country as a liberal democracy?
It says that the promise floating out there in the words in the Declaration was ignored in the early Republic. Nobody looked at the Declaration in the early Republic. Some everyone said, oh, this is amazing, let's found a country around this. It's like, he was out there, and then they wrote a constitution and didn't do those things, and then when people started realizing the country was going to break apart because the slavery wasn't going away and all these other frictions were happening, we need to have a story about why we're supposed to be together. And that's when the next generation came along, Bancroft and the people, and took the words of the Declaration, this is what the country should be about. Right? So yeah, all of those things, the commitment in some regions, there was no commitment to the values of the Declaration. Jefferson himself is a complicated figure, right? He's from the Tidewater. So the Tidewater, the difference between Tidewater and again the American nation stuff. So Deep South was founded in Charleston by West Indies English slave planters who run out of land in Barbados and invented a horrifying slave system with slave gangs and wiping people out. If it profited for your sugar, the whole 9 yards was already developed when they came to Charleston and created a Caribbean-style slave plantation there. Tidewater came earlier, and it wasn't that. The original model was they were the lesser sons of the English manor families from the countryside in the early 1600s. They were the second, and third, and fourth, and fifth sons who weren't going to inherit the estate. They got nothing. Go be a priest. Go be a soldier, and find your fortune because your older brother is going to own everything. Then they discover the New World, and suddenly there's a possibility the second, third, fourth, fifth son could go and create their own manor estate. In other words, they were trying to go and reproduce the manorial system of the English countryside. They were like little Lord Granthams trying to go out and make their own Downton Abbeys. But they get out there, and lo and behold, nobody wants to play the part of the serf. And they tried, nobody would do it. They did indentured servants. Indentured servants were like, oh, thanks for the hoe and the 200 pounds, I'm out of here. Right? And so it wasn't until you got right in the 1690s and 1700s where no one volunteered to be serfs, and the deference was falling apart of the frontier, the indentured servants were working, that they turned, they saw what the Deep Southerners were doing in the 1670s, they're like, oh, we'll do slates, we'll put a slave system in since we don't have serfs. So you get enlightened gentlemen who think that they're like Lord Grantham, we're the head, those are the hands, logically we're raised and more sophisticated, but we have obligations to people below us, at least they think they do. And that's the model of Jefferson and George Washington and Madison. They're all slave plantation owners, but with these lovely enlightened educations. And so yeah, Jefferson is that collision of tidewater thinking that could lead somebody to write those words and yet be owning all these people that violate them and all begin with. So what I'm saying is the Declaration is an incredible idea that nobody was acting on, certainly when those immigration acts were filed in the 1790s, and in a sense, weren't acted on really until the 1960s. Right? It was a big battle. The first even idea we should act on is Bancroft in the 1830s and the counter battle. That's when Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery, gets discovered by the abolitionists, going around saying that. Like his speeches, you know, these are great ideals, you ought to try them, right? I know that you're not living up to them, you white American, white Yankees and Midlanders, because I'm an escaped slave. It's terrible for the masters and everybody else. That was his argument. Trying to get people to stand up for the ideals, because nobody was. And so my big lesson is the whole liberal democracy thing. It's much more fragile than you think, and we haven't been one for very long because we had all of that baggage from before. So, but it's a good thing, and we should be awake to the fact that it doesn't sustain itself and protect itself. You got to fight for it. Each generation has.
That's a great note to end on. Please join me. Eisenhower Institute and Gettysburg College together would like to thank you for being a distinguished guest speaker for our Democracy
Thanks so much.
and for Constitution Day. We appreciate that you have come and really sort of begin to give us some new narrative of some things that we should be thinking about as we embark on these conversations.
Thanks so much. My pleasure to be here.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for coming.
So,